before councils can be pretty complicated. In all the hearings can be quite elongated. There's a whole lot of processes to go through, whether it's wildlife permits, archaeology authorities. Another option we can look at is the fast track, which there has been a lot of opposition to. If we're going ahead with offshore sand mining, so there are some developers out there willing to use that process. We look at it more as it's sort of a one-stop shop. We can get all of our approvals under the one process. We're certainly not looking at having any shortcuts. We want to do a good job, so that's engagement. We've got to do all the ecological assessments, all the environmental assessments. The one advantage with the fast track is we can get cut to the chase pretty what we want to do in terms of design and mitigation. And as a general co-op, we want to leave the land in a better state ecologically than what we've inherited it. So in this area, there's a lot of, you could say, a lot of damage that's been done to the pastoral landscape out there. There's a lot of, over time, there's been a lot of earthworks that have been undertaken. So I think we can probably do certainly a better job in terms of ecological state. So particularly important to us, we've done with other developments where we've the ecology side of things, landscape, archaeology, and the cultural effects, so we want to do a really good job on this one. We're here for a long time, as Guy mentioned, and we're still pretty early on in the stage of design, so we've got opportunity to build the mitigation of the project. In terms of the design of we've sort of been ecologically led. We start off with landscape ecology and we build that into the design. So we want to add in the cultural elements so we can, again, get some benefits with that. So at this point, I'll hand over to Stephen Fuller, who's our ecologist. We're going to go through all the specialist consultants, their advice. So here I can answer any part-time. But as we Guy waiting for us, but we'll get through the effects assessment. We can take as long as you like, or we can take questions. So
I've got some questions.
Yeah.
So what is the total land area that this project will cover in hectares?
Yeah, it's about 5,000 hectares in total, but we might be.
Yes, the generation site is about 5,000 hectares.
Right, and so from one point to the other in terms of kilometres, what would the distance be? Roughly?
10 kilometres.
Okay. And approximately how many kilometres of tracks will be through there?
Good point.
In the region of 25 to 35 kilometres.
Okay. And do any of these land blocks abut the conservation lands?
There is
Good
there
point.
are land blocks which so the outstanding natural landscape is this area, which we'll talk about a bit more. This area is the Dock Reserve landscape. So yeah, the land parcel 2, any of our infrastructure is not within those areas.
Okay. So I'm just going to give a personal view, is that, you know, all along there is conservation land and most of it is taken up by forestry at the moment. So we've been pretty much excluded from these lands because of the fact that they're under forestry. And so I guess, and then we've been excluded from the other lands too because, you know, they've been stolen lands that were confiscated and, you know, have ended up out of our hands. So my query is this, you know, how do we get access into those lands? And just as an example, for, you know, if we went from the beginning of the conservation estate, which is down at Kaiiwi, and it could take us right up to the end of the other side of Waitotara. That's a huge area that potentially in years to come could become, a mountain biking track, for example, if we could get access to it. And so Meridan, in your negotiations with landowners, you're the ones that could potentially open up access for us onto those tracks and that sort of thing. Is that something that you would consider?
Good point.
Yeah, I think that's good. Good point. It's not a technical answer.
Yeah, I think they should have done it on doing the work. I think the history of how they went forward.
Because there are examples overseas where, some mountain bike tracks have been created under wind farms, especially when you're out, got this amazing view of the sea. So I guess it's an opportunity that I would like to put on the table that we explore, because of those relationships with the farmers in terms of getting access to the land, this would probably be our one and best chance of anything like that. Kia ora.
Good point.
Any other parts of our fast track I can, catch up later if you want? Or, Otherwise, Steve?
My brain's just gone, but I'm sorry. I'm Stephen Fuller, and I'm a college of botanist, and I've been asked, me and my team have been asked to do the ecological assessments for this site. We've been working on the site now since early 2023. The main reason for getting into the site early is that many of our studies have required over a year of investigation for things such as birds and bats. So we've had teams on site since March 2023. We've finished most of our studies now, just in the last couple of months. And so this is just a summary of the things that we've found and are working on. In terms of project shaping, this is a process where we provide information to the developer that helps them shape the design of the project. So when we've finished all of our investigations, we develop constraints maps for the developer, and it shows areas which are high value, areas which have very low values, and areas in between. And that helps us determine areas where we need to be really careful and areas that we can develop without too many problems. The constraints maps that we've provided for this project into Meridan, and we've had a number of workshops over those. We've looked at different aspects of the design with the goal of ultimately avoiding effects wherever we possibly can. So we're avoiding effects on indigenous vegetation. Where we can, we're avoiding effects on significant habitats of fauna. And we're doing this by ways of shifting turbines around and the ways that we provide buffers and things like that. So we're just starting to develop our assessment now for the site. And along with that assessment, we'll also be developing a number of management plans which look at monitoring after the wind farm's been built to see that all of our expectations are being met, that the areas that we found important have been protected. So just some examples of some of the work. So it's a very boring vegetation map. With most of it's purple, which is exotic forestry. The site is very heavily modified. There's very little indigenous vegetation left. Some of the bigger areas of indigenous vegetation are actually areas that are planted by the landowners along streams and things like that. But certainly by mapping them, we've been able to identify them as part of the design process and avoid them if we can. The other thing this map tells us is where we should be looking for habitat of fauna. And so the various maps that we've produced have informed how we did our fauna surveys.
some years ago we docked our plant that only grows here. So it's that big. And we named it White Carbon. And we took that plant up to where other places used it. Which is up on So I'm wondering whether this will have an impact on this plant. It is the only place in New Zealand that has this plant. Only about the fact that we've renamed it. I can't remember the scientific name of the plant. So have you come across that with the...
We have identified a number of plants, but really plants are all outside the wind farm site and the significant areas down here where all the wetlands and dunes. But if you've got a photograph, it would be really interesting to see. And we'll let you know if it's anywhere during those days.
We took it up on the plant, as I say.
Can I just back off that on another matter? Because we've got another farm around here, and that's our Ventifax. So the Ventifax that have been, we have them because of the wind patterns here. And so my question is, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I understood that when that trailer load of Ventifax was returned back to Tauranga Ika, they weren't placed back out at the beach because once you've moved them and the wind formation has changed, it's no good. So I guess I'm thinking with all this change in wind direction, what impact's that going to have on the Ventifax?
Possibly not.
Yeah, there won't be any impact on those the Ventifax drops. We don't influence the wind conditions or any of the natural conditions, just take the energy from them.
And we have, early on when we were doing some of our early wind farms like Westwind, we did consider whether or not there'd be an effect of turbulence on native forest that was nearby, but that wasn't an effect. No effect on it. In addition to just the broad vegetation patterns, we've looked in more detail at the locations of wetlands. Again, because it's a dune landscape, it drains very well, so wetlands aren't very widespread anymore, although there used to be larger wetlands along the Waikato, which have all now been drained. In this map, the red are areas which are definitely wetlands, which need to be protected, and the orange are areas which are more wet pasture. And so they can be protected, they will be, but there is an effect on them, we cannot see an effect. So this is basically a GIS map of the locations of stream, although again, because it's a dune landscape, many of these streams don't flow unless there's really heavy rain or something like that. But obviously, what I highlighted for us was the networks of lakes and dunes and ponds where woodfowl are present, and there's been a lot of work at trying to avoid these woodways in the design process. We've done about 14 months of bird surveys across the site. So the pink circles are surveys of terrestrial birds, just general movement of birds across the site. And what we do is we determine relative abundance, the distribution across the site, how they're using the site, their different behaviours, how high they're flying, all those sorts of details are gathered by our field teams.
Did you see any cover we did?
Sorry? And the answer is yes. The green circles are where we've surveyed for water birds, so manaku, Indian ducks, garusha duck, and those sorts of species. So we've done fairly comprehensive surveys. And yet most of those birds don't come inland, they're restricted to their coastal area and some dunelands. We have a number of birds which fly up and down on the coastline every day. And we have this network of little dune lakes and streams along the back here. So we have all the foundry factors and tours along here. And of course, up the Winding Stream. So we have a good idea where the birds are active and what their bird habitats are, where they're most abundant, and from that we're developing an assessment for the wind farm project. Yes.
When you're giving us this information, are you identifying the bird species?
Yes. So, for example, the key bird species that we've found along these dune slate swales and ponds are white heron, manitou bittern. We've got 4 species of shag that occupy parts of the site, and Derbyshire. So each of these has a different suite of birds that use the habitat. Down here it's more the coastal species like Caspian tern, and up in here it's more waterfowl birds.
And what's your survey longitudinal research project, or was it just a snapshot of time?
So it was a baseline, and we had teams on site for a week a month for 12 months, and then we had targeted surveys during the 2 migration events. So we did surveys and we had our teams on site during January and August when Tauranga were flying, and we also had bioacoustic surveys for the bitten booming, and we had people on site during the bitten booming as well.
That's great. That's really great, actually. Quite comprehensive, but it's quite short term. And given the seasonal changes that we're experiencing here in Aotearoa at the moment, we have particularly blooming at different times, our species of fruiting at different times, so there's a real high probability that the migration patterns of our birds are going to start shifting a little bit as well. What sort of historical research have we done to look for migration change that might impact the future, given what we know about climate change?
Well, there are a range of publications by Department of Conservation and their scientists which have tracked changes in migration primarily at the sources of the birds. So we know over the last 20 years roughly how many birds arrive at each estuary every year and depart each estuary every year, and we know that for all migratory species. The other thing is I did a similar project at Waipipi, so we monitored the migrant species there, and then on top of that the Department of Conservation has recently started putting transmitters on migrant species and monitoring their movements around the country. And so what we are finding is that the migrants that come past up the west coast of the North Island tend to be in relatively low numbers. The primary migratory route is from field spit to Tauranga. And so we're just on the edge of that route.
Understanding that, but we still want to support and maintain that minority on those islands.
Sure.
And potentially increase that if we possibly can. So with those kind of expectations in play with the strategy, we'd really like to see how you can help us in soft benefits improve those outcomes for those species.
Sure. The migrants may be more difficult because, as you say, they do things, they ship around. But there are certainly a number of species within the site where there would be a lot of benefits that they could gain from your active management. Sure.
Those proposals do require more.
I think maybe I'll talk about that now. So everyone's concerned about wind turbines and works, and one of the things I've been fortunate enough to do is I haven't just been consenting wind farms, but I've been had the role of monitoring the wind farms after they've been built, and so we've now looked at 5 or 6 wind farms followed through between 2 and 5 years after construction to see whether there have been date in New Zealand there have been no mortalities of significant threat species. So all mortalities tend to be related to birds which are most abundant on the site. It tends to be where wind farms are built as the pastoral landscape, so it tends to be skylarks and magpies, black-backed gulls. The only native species which is affected by wind farms is kahu, is the harrier. And that's simply because of its behaviour. It tends to fly at the right height, at the right times. But we've monitored mortalities of kahu, and we haven't seen any obvious signs of changes to the broader population. They're not being affected in large numbers to affect the population.
So you're doing base numbers of the populations as well, or is that based?
Yes, so the baseline is the thing that we measure mortality against. So at Waipiki, they've now finished their 4th year of monitoring at Waipiki. When we did our baseline, there were 34 native species present within the wind farm site, and there have only been 5 native species that have been affected by the turbines. So that's, as I said, kahu, black-backed gull, paradise shellacs, spurred plovers, but very low numbers. The high numbers tend to be the finches and the magpies. It's all available through the council, so every report that's reviewed goes to the council. We've also surveyed for pickerfoot bats, long-tailed bats, and there is definitely movement of bats around the site in low numbers, and almost certainly across the whole wider landscape. They don't appear to be roosting in the site, so they seem to be coming from further afield and potentially the footballs along here at those sites. So we're looking at whether there's going to be a potential effect on bats and whether there's management. And lizard surveys, we did a lot of lizard surveys. I'm sorry, it's not a good map, but we used every method we could. We used artificial cover, we used pitfalls, we used cameras, we used ground searching, and we went to all of the best locations for lizards, and we only found 3 lizards in 2 months. They were all in northern grassland. So that's not to say that along the coastline there aren't other species. We know in the past there have been about 3 other skink species found along the dunelands, but within the pastoral landscape that the wind farms will be built on, we couldn't find them. So, and I think partly that's due to the fact that the landscape is so heavily modified by farming, but also because there's a huge predator presence on the site. I wouldn't want to be a lizard. So this was some of our cameras. So we had these boxes set up for monitoring lizards, and we saw no lizards in these boxes. But almost every photo that was taken had a mouse or a stoat or a ferret or a weasel with each of them. So, and as we know, predation is one of the biggest impacts that our native fauna faces at the moment. And that's me. Thank you very much.
No, would that, you know, what we find out about those areas of cultural impact assessment would be used to like inform the landscape assessment and understand what the values of the area. But we also consider other things to do with character and value of the landscape. So, you know, that Waisaika is a good corridor and coastline and during the landscape, there's a rural kind of farming that character in there. And we also have to look at the cumulative effects. So that's like the combined effect of having this wind farm with Waisaika wind farm. And the effect on those valued landscapes for that Bonneville outstanding character area. And yeah, effects on other areas as well. And then in terms of visual effects, so what we do as part of the assessment is we obviously can't go everywhere, but what you do is you take a range of like representative views from publicly accessible places in the landscape, and you know, we go to those locations and take photographs and kind of make an assessment that builds up a picture of what the visual effects of this development is. So we do that from public locations, but also from private locations as well. So we're in the process of going out to sort of affected dwellings that are within the vicinity of the wind farm, and we'll go and do some visits with them as well and take photographs from there. Yeah, so the views that we've got, obviously, like all the roads, so not just State Highway 3, but all those kind of little local roads that come off State Highway 3 and provide access to properties. Obviously, residents and all the nearby settlements. And then we consider things like people who are visiting the coast, visiting Waimea Beach, visiting Waimea Beach, Kaiwi, visiting the river and the river mount, and the railway line. So that's just a bit of an overview of that.
In terms of the visual impacts, like the strongest visual impacts we have is at night time when these red lights are flashing. Is there any improvement in the technology so that, you know, they only come on when a plane is close or something, not all night?
Yeah, great part. So, yeah, the Civil Aviation Authority requires that any turbines that are over 150 metres in height, they need to have those red lights and they have to be flashing. So you have one on the nacelle, which is the bit that the blades are connected to, and 3, I think that is on the tower. So I'm not sure exactly what specification the lighting on those Waisaika turbines are, but there's ways you can manage the lighting heat. So one of the things they do is called shielding, and that means that there's sort of a shield under that lights. The light goes upwards because the light's not for us, it's for the planet, right? So it directs the light upwards. So it means that people who are relatively close to the turbines, like living in those houses in the area, they won't actually see those lights, or they won't see them as much. And where you see them to distant, further away from them, or fire up from the counter. Yeah, the second part of that is that civil aviation requirement you have to comply with at the moment. The New Zealand Wind Energy Association, which is kind of the body that of people that have been at Windfarm, so there's members of people like the Meridan members, the engineering firms, all people that are involved in the wind energy industry because they're in kind of negotiation with the aviation industry to look at ways that they can change those requirements. So, for example, I know of like wind farms in Scotland where they have radar activated lights, so that means they only come from plane flights over. But we don't have that law in New Zealand yet, but that's something that the industry wants to work towards. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? So that's probably really as far as I'm going to go. This map is just like a little bit of an overview, and there's actually a big one over there. What we've done is we've prepared some visual simulations and printed out there. Actually, the best way to view them, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate in this state, but the best way to view them is by hanging on the wall. So you know anything about cameras, you know that depending on the way you take a photograph and how zoomed in or how zoomed out it is, it affects your perception of how big something is. So there are best practice standards around how you take photographs or simulations that represents the field of view of the
Where's that? Where's that situated? Not in. Oh gosh. Yeah.
So the yellow points are just like a selection of where the views from the white dots turbines, and then the blue and the green are the solar areas, and then this green line is that outstanding kind of natural landscape areas. So it's got like a view from the there, and there's another one down Waverley Beach here. The yellow points are Waikapi, so there's some views taken from further away that kind of include, that will show what this wind farm will look like in Waikapi at the same time, so that that cumulative effect that I was talking about. But yeah, there's quite a lot of them, and it's quite a lot taken, so I think that we're going to leave those here for everyone, at least so that you've got time to have a look through them and take time to digest it, I think, because there's quite a lot to understand.
And they can't point, right?
Yeah, the little things like, this means each one of these is a 90-degree field of view. So if you have 4 of them, you have 360-degree views. So some of them, most of them are 90 degrees, but there's a few that are 180 degrees, so they've got a view like that, and there's a view like that. So you've got kind of half view like that.
I'd love to see some at night time. It's not beautiful in the day when you're sheet, and also with stormy weather, so we can visually see what it looks like.
Yes.
Mm.
We don't have any night ones yet, but that is our intention to try and produce something like that. It's quite a technical challenge to do, but it is possible to do that, to get that kind of accurate representation of what it looks like. So we've taken some photography that we're going to use. It's actually kind of like on dusk, because that's the best time to do it, because that's when, like, the lights are on, but there's still enough light, so you get almost like the worst effect, if you like. And probably the other thing to note about all the simulations is they're all showing sort of worst case scenario, if you like, the blades are facing you, but obviously depending on the predominant wind direction, you might not actually always be looking at them front on like that, you know, they might be side on, but these are sort of to show you the worst case. Yes.
I didn't see a visual simulation from the other end of the Southern Bight, sort of down towards Kaiui.
There is a few areas in the package that we've got.
We in the car.
We have got one. So we're going to
Good
go.
job.
So,
Appreciate it.
yeah.
What considerations are you putting in place when you take away that and replace it with what you're looking for? So if you have a look up there, that's all going to be taken away.
Yeah.
So what are the considerations
Yeah.
in terms of taking that view away from us?
Forever.
Forever,
Yeah.
or at least 35 years,
Yeah.
unless we get a wood heat for you.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, no, look, I mean, Emma can speak to the landscape aspects, and I guess it's up to Meridan to speak to the cultural mitigations and what we understand that there's got to be benefits for not only for the project. And I guess, it's up to that. So I think, Emma, do you have any more to say? Yeah, so we'll be on and I can talk to that. Yeah. The spoken here from the visual, might be one of the things. The hearing impacts. Vibration. I haven't picked up on anything which is oh, it's so we have Stephen and Emma here today, but in our whole group of consultants we have acoustic effects consultant, archaeologist, shadow effects as well. So on the noise, the work we've done today is we've provided the noise that the equipment would generate to a consultant, and then create a model of what the noise levels would be at different locations.
assessment is they monitor the background noise, so and down at the coast there'll be a lot of sea noise and that kind of thing. So that builds up their picture of what the current noise levels are and what the change would be from a project. So in New Zealand, there are regulations around what the noise generated, or the noise received by people in the vicinity of a project can be, and we design it so that when people are at their houses, that the noise is below the level, which is around 40 decibels, which is So we basically we do this work, then we can provide that noise contours, so it says at which